Hi, Faith. Can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
I can. So we're going to have you turn your camera off and mute for the beginning of the program. And then as I introduce you, you put your camera on and just keep it on then. Great. We're just getting ready to go. Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you and thank you so much for being here today with us for this really, really important discussion and conversation. If you signed up for Closing the Inequity Gap in the Workplace for Women program, you're in the right spot. And we really do have an incredible panel of experts in this area today and are so fortunate to have them joining us. So we're going to go ahead and move into the program right now before we do some introductions and get into our program. Before we get started, though, I want to make sure that our mission is to eliminate racism and empower women. And that means that we work toward right relationships with Native people. Today, we acknowledge the Boulder Valley's history, and in the words of Right Relationship Boulder's organization, we want to acknowledge that the land where we live today is the territory of the Hinona-ai Arapaho people. We honor Chief Left Hand, leader of the last Hinona-ai band to spend their winters in Boulder Valley. In our daily social justice. And we've been doing this work for a long time. We've actually been in Boulder County for about 99 years. And across the United States, we have been doing this work for 160 years. And so today, we're focusing in on an issue that has always been a challenge, especially as we look at economic advancement for women, but especially during this time. With COVID, it's been even more challenging. So as we look at the wage gap, and we'll give just a moment for the slide. So this is actually just taking a look. This is, of course, one lens of this from the ACLU, and really looking at, and this was pre-COVID, compared with white men, where women are in terms of their earning power, in terms of comparing them with similar jobs, similar experience, and the discrepancy that we're seeing. So, of course, we are seeing the gap get greater and greater as we are looking at for women of color, and especially Latina women. So we're going to make sure we address that in the conversation today, because it's especially important as we're really in this place of a she session right now. So before we really jump into our panel, we want to share briefly a news piece that was put together by CBS. It really talks about this intersecting point with COVID and the pay wage gap. So let's take a look.
Well, the Equal Pay Act passed in 1963. It made gender-based wage discrimination illegal. But more than 50 years later, women are still paid less than men. And the pandemic could be making the situation even worse. Michelle Miller explains.
Personal trainer and Cameroonian immigrant Simone Chuke knows the importance of working hard.
On average, I would do about 20 sessions, so about 5 to 8 sessions a day.
So when the pandemic hit, how did it impact your business?
It was really bad. We just kind of like scaled down to like nothing, so enough to like pay your rent and pay food, and that's it.
During this economic downturn, women have suffered more job losses than men, and women still in the workforce continue to face a grim reality. They also make less than men.
I know a couple of male trainers who have been training as much as I have been training, and I think we more or less have the same experience, and they are able to charge more per session. And it's always so weird, like, I don't know why, but as a woman, it's always so hard to kind of like impose my price.
In 2018, women earned about 82 cents for every dollar earned by men. For Black women, 62 cents, and for Latina women, just 54 cents. This is a driver of the wealth gap, which can mean a woman at retirement age accumulates about $1 million less than her male counterpart.
I think it has to do with a lot of antiquated gender norms and roles and expectations that we have around who is the primary breadwinner in families.
Nicole Mason is the president and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research.
COVID-19 has hit women particularly hard. Why?
The sectors that were hardest hit by the pandemic were sectors where women were predominantly in our focus. So the service sector, education, health services, those sectors were hardest hit. And when you couple that with the pay gap and lack of savings, economic shock like the pandemic really hurts and cripples working women, especially lower wage women.
She says shutdowns across the country put working moms at a disadvantage.
There's no school, there's no daycare, and women are expected to do it all. They're expected to work 40 hours a week and still be the primary caregiver. And it's just an impossible situation for most women, especially women who don't have the option of working remotely or home.
Like Haisha Gonzalez, a mom of two from Connecticut.
It's been a struggle trying to decide what to do.
She will likely leave her job as a paraeducator to homeschool her children this fall.
That's definitely going to leave a gap in my resume. I don't know how it's going to be going back, if they're going to have me back. And then obviously, the lack of income and financial goals, that has to take a step back for a while.
The pay gap persists because gender-based pay discrimination, although illegal, is widespread. Women also work in lower-paying jobs and might not have access to paid family leave or affordable childcare.
So the pay gap won't close. If we do nothing, it won't close for another 40 years. For Black and Latino women, it won't close for more than 100 years, so a century. So essentially, my daughter or my daughter's daughter won't see pay equity in their lifetime. This conversation that we're having around the pay gap and wealth building, and also building an economy, a more equitable economy that works for everyone, I think the pandemic and COVID has really provided us an opportunity to think about women workers,
including Simone Chuke.
Hopefully things get better. So my goal is to create videos online on my website where people can subscribe and have access to my workouts.
Like so many others, she's trying to salvage her business, but plans to move out of New York City because she can no longer afford it.
I want to work. Like I just want to work. Even when I say I need assistance, I don't need somebody to give me money. I just need work,
It's interesting to see how many of these issues the pandemic has put an extra spotlight on, including the wage gap.
Yeah, such an important story, and you hope that the people who have the ability to change that will also be enlightened, if you will.
I would hope.
All right. So I don't know if that makes your blood boil. It does make mine. And it's why we need to keep talking about this, and we need to keep making sure that we're pushing forward in this. So before we go into introducing the panelists, I want to lift up this piece of information. And thanks to Boulder Community Foundation, this is actually from their trends report. And, this is really mind-boggling when we saw this. And we're looking at Boulder County in particular, that we're seeing the gap even greater as there's more education. So if you look at the graduate or professional degree for a woman in Boulder County, it's averaged about $55,000. If you look at that for a graduate or professional degree for a man, the median in Boulder County is about $96,000. And of course, you can see on your screen, as we've circled some college, bachelor's degree, and graduate or professional degree. And then, we pair this with the annual cost of childcare, which you can see some numbers there, and the difference. So in Boulder County, families are paying nearly $27,000 for childcare. And then we're also seeing these big gender pay wage gaps. So Boulder Community Foundation partnered with us to provide some initial grant dollars to really start looking into that. And one of our panelists today, Michelle Frierson, will touch on this and what we found out here locally as well. But I know the reason you're all here is for our just incredible panelists. So let me go ahead and introduce them right now. And first of all, Ann Winkler. Welcome, Ann. She is a professor of economics and public policy administration at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. She's also a research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Labor. And in addition to serving on several editorial boards, she's also the co-author of the book, The Economics of Women, Men, and Work. In its 8th edition right now, it's the most current and comprehensive source available for research, data, and analysis on women, gender, and economics. And Winkler is also widely known for her research and contributions on the study of economics and gender. Welcome, Ann. We're so happy to have you here and joining us from Missouri, so a few states over. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Our next panelist is Dr. Sabrina Volpone, and she's an assistant professor of the Organizational Leadership Division of the University of Colorado's Leeds School of Business. She earned her PhD in Human Resource Management from the Fox School of Business at Temple University. And at the Leeds School of Business, she is the doctoral program coordinator for the Organizational Leadership and Information Analytics Division, and also runs the Diversity and Identity Management Research Lab, which is really dedicated to pioneering research on diversity management and identity management with a focus on examining these topics as they relate to the workplace experiences of traditionally underrepresented employees. So, Sabrina, thank you so much for being a part of this incredible group of women coming together today. And then it's with great pleasure, we're so grateful that Colorado Representative Faith Winters is joining us today in the midst of a very busy schedule. So thanks for being here, Faith. She's a legislator here in Colorado. Many of us know her. In 2018, she was elected to the Colorado State Senate, representing District 24. And earlier, she served in the Colorado House of Representatives from 2014 to 2019, representing Colorado House District 35. Faith has been a champion for women as a working mom. She understands that women need equal pay for equal work and accessible reproductive health care. And as a survivor of sexual harassment at work, the safe workplace policies are a major priority for her. So welcome, Representative Winters. And finally, surely last but not least, is Michelle Frierson. Michelle is a doctoral student at the University of Colorado's Boulder School of Education, and she was also the researcher who partnered with us on the first phase of work of really looking at the gender pay wage gap analysis. So thank you all so much for being here, and great. So we're going to start by asking a few questions of each of you, and then I would like to let our participants know that as you have questions, please put them in the question and answer box. And we will be using sort of the last part of our session today to make sure that we answer those as well. So as we're going through this, please just feel free to go ahead and put your questions in the box. So I want to start with you, Ann.
Okay.
And over your years of studying this issue, what can you tell us in terms of trends in the gender pay wage gap and the variables contributing to this inequity?
Sure. So I thought the video was a really good start to today's discussion, and it fits really in well. So in the 1970s, women were wearing buttons, I've seen them, that said 59 cents on the dollar. And as in the video today, that button would say 82 cents on the dollar. Now today we're talking about the gender pay gap, and just so everybody's clear, that's the flip side of these numbers. So it would be like in the past, wearing a button that said 41 cents, and now the button would say 18 cents. So my summary statement about what's been going on is that since probably about the early 1980s to present, the gender pay gap has decreased. And from the 41 cents to the 18 cents, and that's good news. But I think we also know that it's persisting, and it's much greater, obviously, for women of color. So what I wanted to do was just say a little bit more about the figures. And Debbie, you had said initially there's just lots of figures that are out there, and discuss that a little bit more. So when we look at the current 80 cents on the dollar figure, that's a number that's coming from the Census Bureau, which was sourced on the table. And that's telling us about typical or median earnings and how they compare for women and men who are both full-time employed and who work throughout the year. So when we're looking at that number, something that's always important to think about, it's not specifically comparing women and men, for example, with the same, what we call human capital, this stock of skills and knowledge that you bring to the workplace. So there's a host of factors that economists and other social scientists look at in trying to understand the source of the pay gap, trends in the pay gap. So education and years of experience are two crucial parts of human capital. And on the good side, and this is what explains some of that decline, women's educational attainment has gone way up. And in fact, the gender difference in educational attainment has reversed. So that's good news. And also the gender difference in work experience between women and men, that's diminished substantially. So that's contributing to that reduction that we were talking about. Another piece of it has always been, and it continues to be, is that women and men are located in different occupations and industries. And absolutely, I'm in a male profession. Lots of women are entering into male professions, but nonetheless, there's still a lot of what economists call occupational segregation. If you look just at something simply like K to 12, it's still very much dominated by women. So there's change, but still a large part of what's still persisting are differences in occupations and industries. I wanted to say something, another factor is labor market discrimination. And I just wanted to say what that means in terms of, for economists, basically what that's saying is that after we're comparing individuals who have the same qualifications, do we still see systematic pay differences between women and men? And that's what we would attribute to labor market discrimination. And the answer on that from statistical analyses, from lab and field experiments is yes, there are still differences that remain. I wanted to mention a couple of other pieces that are important and are getting a lot of attention, and that's the motherhood penalty, the penalty to being a mother in the workforce versus being a non-mother. And that's another case where there's evidence, both from statistical analyses and from field and lab experiments, that even with mothers and non-mothers have the same human capital, and so the same work experience, the same education, et cetera, they're still being differentially paid. And that would be evidence, as I said, of labor market discrimination. So there's something going on there. Some other avenues that are important to also think about is this set of other types of factors, might be called psychological factors, soft skills, these other factors, including differences in competitiveness, but a big one that gets attention is willingness to negotiate. And women's willingness and ability to negotiate, and also how that's perceived in the workplace, is another piece. And then I finally like to say, because I don't want to, I want to make sure everybody has time, but a lot of times there's a lot of focus on starting salaries. And I think we also want to be thinking about not only the wage gap or what wages look like, even if they're very similar, but of course, even a penny difference makes a difference down the line, 40 years down the line, but also to think about what happens in terms of promotion and career advancement opportunities. And you can also look and see if women and men have the same qualifications, are they being promoted and advanced at the same rates? And in many areas, the answer is no. So let me cut off there for others.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. That's great. I mean, that's a wealth of information for us to absorb. And Sabrina, I think that goes kind of nicely into thinking about some of the other key factors that you really think and believe are contributing to inequities in the workplace. I know Anne mentioned some, and maybe you want to build on those or mention others too.
Of course. And when we just have a question that really tackles the idea of inequalities, of course, we want to start with, structural sexism, structural racism, bad policies. But I kind of want to move beyond some of those that were talked about in the video, and then build on the great points Anne made, and talk about a specific section of or lens way to look at inequalities that I've taken in my research, and that is to look at the double-edged sword that women face in the workplace, and then see how that impacts the wage gap. And so when we say double-edged sword, we're really talking about this simultaneous experience that women have at work at being hyper visible at the same time that they're invisible. And I'll explain what that means a little bit more. So on one hand, women and other marginalized individuals tend to be very hyper visible. And this brings on a lot of the psychological effects that Anne was speaking to, and other impacts of being treated like a token, always feeling like they're being on display, increased stigma because all of their work and behaviors are kind of under a microscope because they stick out because they're the only one or they're unique. And if we want to specifically look at inequalities in the pay gap, as Anne alluded to, this can really start being a problem during the interview process and the negotiation of salaries. And so I have some recent work that shows our expectations of marginalized individuals. We looked at racial minorities, in particular, the experiences of Black negotiators, but we've also seen this replicated in research for women as well, that the hiring managers expect different negotiation behaviors of certain individuals. And so if you aren't really able to have that conversation of, this is my worth, this is what I bring to the organization, specifically in our study, we found that the number of times you go back and forth trying to actually negotiate during that salary as an applicant, you can have the same exact number of times you did that back and forth with the hiring manager. But when you have a marginalized identity, you're seen as more aggressive. You're seen very differently, even though it's the same number of times. And you can see how that would be true for women as well. The workplace's managers' expectations of how they behave, even from day one when they're negotiating their salaries, is different. And so that hyper visibility of them always being under the microscope, their behaviors, how they are acting, those, women, it really increases this hyper visibility experience, really increases some of the negative outcomes that we're seeing that are contributing to inequalities. And at the same time, simultaneously, being invisible on a number of things that are also really important that organizations aren't considering. So those are the struggles unique to women's lived experience that can be caring for generations, both below, like the video talked about, not enough daycare, schools being closed. But also, if we really think about the times we're in now with COVID, there's a lot of elder care of generations above that are falling on women's shoulders. And I don't think that was mentioned in the video. So I wanted to contribute that point as well. And so when those additional barriers to women's lived experience as contributors to society and the workforce are invisible, at the same time they're being kind of hyper visible and under the microscope in a lot of other ways. Both of these are working together simultaneously to really put women in a corner to where I'll give you an example and then we can move on. I know other panelists have a lot of great points to make. But if you really kind of think about what this simultaneous hypervisibility and invisibility means, I have found myself in this position where you're trying to explain to your boss or maybe your organization, like, no, these are the barriers I'm facing. This, I'm doing more service work than other people, or this is happening, like trying to make people realize that things are there is inequity or unfairness or bias in the workplace, trying to change things. And sometimes I've even found myself in this position that a lot of times managers or organizations use this simultaneous experience of hypervisibility and invisibility against you to really be able to get out of that kind of inequity or bias. And so what I mean by that is you can say, look, I have so much more service as a woman than I do as a man. Like my contributions are not being paid equally. They're not being valued the same. And they'll be like, no, what are you talking about? You know, we put you on the front of our website. We ask you to be on every committee. And like the woman's thinking, okay, so you're asking me to do more, and because there's only one or two or three of me, I have this increased service or increased like representation for the organization that you're not realizing. And then you're using that as an argument against why I'm saying my struggles are invisible. And so sometimes we can find ourselves in this corner of even logic, you know, using plain logic to describe our situation. Organizations, maybe managers, people that may not be aware of some of these occurrences, these invisible loads on our shoulders as women, are kind of being used against us or used as part of the logic not to, you know, get out of this inequality and this biased situation. And so we have a lot of work to do, of course, as we all know, which is why we're all here. But I really think that simultaneous experience of being hypervisible and invisible is really contributing to the inequalities that we see sometimes, and also managers or organizations' responses to, no, I'm not seeing that. And so I just kind of wanted to present it in that way because I take that lens sometimes with my research.
Thank you. That just explained a lot, because I think we've all found ourselves in these situations where it feels a little crazy making, and that really makes a lot of sense,
work.
right? That it's these two things that are contradictory happening at the same time. Yeah, great point. All right, Representative, here we go. And looking at our laws, especially as we look at Colorado. So we've passed legislation to address inequity for women in the workplace with the Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. And still we see these numbers and these trends, and even what Sabrina's talking about. So how and when can women expect to see this reflected in their work life? And how are employers being held accountable?
Yeah, so we've actually done a lot of work in Colorado and have more work to be done. And I can legislate laws, and oftentimes we want those laws to change culture, but that doesn't actually happen overnight. And so we have to do that work simultaneously. We have to both change the systems and structures that create these problems and also change the culture. So we did pass an Equal Pay for Equal Work Act that just went into effect January 1st of this year. And that is really exciting because that law does a lot of different things. One of the most important things that it does is employers can no longer ask you your salary history. And that's really important because when we start our careers, we are more likely to be paid less, right? And then that follows us our entire lives if we keep being asked our salary history. And so if I start my career being paid $1,000 less than a man, and then I'm seen as aggressive, as been brought up when I negotiate that salary, I'm less likely, and he might get a $7,000 bump, and I get a $5,000 bump in my next job. And now I'm $3,000 behind, and that gets perpetuated from job to job. So that's really important. Also, it requires employers to list salary ranges. And so that when we walk in and can negotiate, we actually know, okay, I think this is what I'm worth. The company is looking at hiring people from 55,000 to 65,000. And I'm going to go in and ask for 61 because that's what I think I'm worth. And so it actually makes the negotiation process better as well. It also puts a cap on that so that the men in the system actually know where they're supposed to negotiate to as well. And so that's really important. It also requires companies to keep track of positions and what they're paying, because we know that positions that women are more likely to fill are paid less. So let's start tracking that data and finding that data. And it also requires employers to disclose hourly salary and compensation for each job opening, right? So we can actually see what's happening and what's going on. And so that was in our Equal Pay for Equal Work Act. But other things that we've done in Colorado is we also passed the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. And so we found a lot of women were leaving the workforce because they needed basic accommodations at work for being pregnant and working, and weren't being given that. And it could be as simple as a water bottle if you're a bank teller and your doctor says you need to be better hydrated and you need a water bottle. Or if you're a checker and you need a stool because you shouldn't be on your feet for 8 hours, or you're stocking shelves and your doctor says you can't stock shelves with packages over 25 pounds for a while. Like, we can make those accommodations. So we passed the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act. And then probably what I'm most well known for fighting for is paid family leave, which Colorado just passed. We were the first state in the country to pass it on the ballot. I worked on this for 6 years, worked really hard on the ballot initiative, and that's going to go into effect. We'll start collecting premiums in 2023, and every single worker in Colorado is going to have paid family leave for up to 12 weeks in 2024. And that's a really big deal because one of the reasons we see this pay gap be so persistent is that women often leave the workforce when they have to be a caregiver. And they are more likely to stay in the workforce, stay at their job, and earn more money when they have paid family and medical leave. And so that's going to make a huge difference. And then finally, we have seen what the pandemic has done, and it's just forcing women out of the workforce in really high rates. And that's going to be problematic because you take a year or two off to do remote learning with your children, and then you're going to be behind in your wages again, and behind in negotiations, and then behind in advancement. So I'm a working mom. I'm a state senator. I also have other jobs because actually we should also pay your elected officials better as well. And I train women to run for office, and in states that have lower pay rates, we actually elect more women because women are willing to take on the unpaid rate of being a public servant and men aren't. So that is on a side note, because I also know one of those things we have to do is elect more women to solve this. But so I have several jobs, and I'm a state senator, and I've been doing remote learning with my children, and it is so hard right now, right? There was an article that said it's a hellscape that we never saw coming, and it really is. And so one of the things I'm doing this year is an update to CADA, which is the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act. And there's 3 things we're doing in this bill that are going to really help address the pay gap and help women in the workforce. The first is we aren't addressing sexual harassment in the workplace in a way that is comfortable for women to come forward. So we're going to make sure that we're updating CADA to allow for better better ways to address sexual harassment in the workplace. We also know there's a lot of age discrimination, and it's harder, especially for older women, to find jobs. So we're going to add age discrimination as a protected class. And finally, we do know that women are less likely to get promoted, less likely to get hired, and less likely to get raises if they're caregivers. So we're adding in caregiving as a protected class under the Colorado Anti-Discrimination Act in a bill coming this year.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Representative Winters. And I have to say, we do need to, I think, just take a moment to say, goodness, that family leave. And just so you know, Representative Winters, we've been fighting for that with the YWCA and all of our women's, collaborations across and coalitions across the state. So it was really quite a thing to have it just passed on a ballot after all of the work and that you and other legislators and advocacy groups have put into that. So, and what a great thing for us to know what legislation is coming up that we need to support and why. So thank you. So it's really interesting because Anne, you were talking a little bit about, more education, better opportunity for women, pay wage gap, goes down. And yet we see these numbers in Boulder, and it just is really mind-boggling, that we're seeing that gap so much greater, and that the more education, we're actually seeing greater gaps. Now, granted, I know there's lots of ways to look at these numbers and how they're calculated, but Michelle, you spent some time, of course, looking at the broader pieces of this because it's a complicated issue, but you also had talked to people here in Boulder and started to try to get some understanding of where we're seeing it, where that's not being done, is being done well, and just some other insights. So can you share with us a little bit about your research?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, so in looking at Boulder, I felt it was really important to speak to actual women who are in the workforce there and have stories to tell and experiences regarding how they're paid and how they are regarded in their workplace. And on Boulder women having more education, it kind of follows national trends and where women typically have jobs in industries where they are lower paying. And so in order to secure, more finances for their home and for themselves, for their children, they realize that education is probably the best avenue to get there. However, I think to Sabrina's point, once they have this education, and also to Anne's point, negotiation becomes important, and then also how women are regarded in the workplace becomes important. And then that creates kind of a divide in how women are paid and men are paid. A lot of the women that I spoke to talked about negotiation, and not that they are going in straight out of the gate doing it, but they're kind of looking at it retrospectively, and like hindsight is 2020, and say, I wish I had done this, or I wish I had said, I want to know what the competitive rate is for this area or for this industry. Or I want to talk about how raises are handled. And so that's an important part of it, is just knowing what you're up against when you are interviewing somewhere. And if you plan to be there for a while, how you're going to be treated and paid is important.
Yeah, great. And I know there's much more to do. This is just was the first phase of looking more deeply at this. Okay, so we've talked about COVID. You just can't get away from it right now, and it really, for women, it's devastating when we see the numbers, and especially the job loss in December. All women. I mean, it really is. We are definitely taking a huge hit, whether it's jobs being eliminated or being forced out, or to represent winners. It feels almost impossible. To be able to do all these things. So there are women who are having to make those hard choices and leave the workforce. So when we're looking at this, Anne, how are you anticipating COVID and the number of women either forced out or leaving the workplace? How do you think this is going to really affect, this already challenging dilemma that we're in? And we've touched on it a little bit, but if you can elaborate more, that would be great.
Yeah, sure, Debbie. So I think, Representative Winter and others have touched on some of these, but just to kind of summarize, because I think it is really important. The current situation that we're in, this COVID recession pandemic, it's unique. It is completely different than the Great Recession. It's just fundamentally different. We have a health crisis, business shutdowns, especially affecting leisure and hospitality, the impact on daycare. We know the impact with respect to schools and these school closures. And I would say that a bottom line, I think, is it's really had an outsized effect on mothers in the workforce. We saw a huge withdrawal of women ages 20 plus from August to September. Yeah.
I'm going to have to step out for a second because I am technically presenting a bill in the health committee right now as well. Dueling Zoom screens. I will be back, and I'm going to go present my pharmacy bill real fast.
Great. Thanks, Faith.
So anyway, I think that it's employed mothers that are really being hit particularly hard. We saw these August to September numbers where women had left the labor force at 4 times the level that men had left. So I think that, just to kind of put this into everybody's mind, pre-pandemic, 70% of all mothers with children under age 18 were employed. That's a vast majority. And if you think about mothers with infants, 42% were in the labor force and working full time. So that's, talk about dual committed. And pre-pandemic, if we look at employed mothers' childcare responsibilities, and just with limits of time and this and that, looking at married couples with children, women spent 1.4 to 1.8 times as many hours doing childcare as men. So pre-pandemic, we've got women employed, these mothers, and with outsized childcare responsibilities. And of course, up front, I'm going to talk a little bit about these high education professional women, but just right up front, that's just one segment of the labor force. But just to talk about the impacts on that particular group, and I think Representative Winter had touched upon this, but prior to the pandemic, we've got these career women, they're on these tracks, they are moving along, and there's something called firm-specific human capital. When you stay at your firm, there's value to the skills that you've acquired and the knowledge that then you can parlay and advance within that firm. Meanwhile, so the women are on these tracks. Where are their kids? They're in daycare, they're at school. And then with COVID, the good news is they kept their jobs. Maybe so many women and men did not, and they were able to go to remote work. But they've got these outsized childcare responsibilities to start, and elder care, which I think Sabrina had mentioned too, which my numbers didn't have that, but that's very important and another burden on women. And so they've got these childcare responsibilities. Women tend to have, and now they've got the schooling and the Zoom and oversight of all of that. In married couple families, women tend to have what's called the secondary career, to the extent that they make a little bit less, they're a little bit more expendable when something has to happen. So when push came to shove, what's happening in these households is that they're the one that's going to be more likely to exit. And for the family, obviously they're going to have less income, but again, I would just say that they're still better off. They still have, say, the husband's income compared to other families, or take single mothers, right? That's what you do there. You don't have that second person in the household, but it's a personal career hit. And our focus today, coming back, I started out on the gender pay gap. And it's a career hit. You're losing out on this firm-specific human capital. At some point, they're going to be able to re-enter, but they're, might likely be re-entering at a new firm. The other thing is too, because we are in a recession, pandemic, unemployment rates are higher. It takes time to find a new job during a recession. It usually, you don't necessarily come in at a job that's exactly at the same pay and other qualities of the job that you had when you exited. So this leads to, what I would say, it's a pay hit. And then the key point here is that to the extent that it's women that have withdrawn from the labor force relative to men, and when they come back, to the extent that they return with slightly lower pay, in terms of the gender pay gap, that's going to increase it. Now, I can't say for the whole pay gap because of the way it's calculated, et cetera, but that would be the tendency when they come back. So, that's an important implication, and I don't want to take up too much time, but I just say that a big open-ended question is the rate at which these women can come back into the labor force is really crucial. The longer the period that you're out, the more significant the consequences. So we've really got to solve the health crisis, get the daycares and the schools back, which puts us, daycare is just, in childcare, is fundamental to the economy, business, et cetera. And then these women can get back on career track. So let me pause there.
Yeah, there's so much to untangle in it, right? And we can't quite see the full ramifications of that yet. We may not see that trend for, 4 or 5 years. The one thing before we jump to you, Sabrina, when Sabrina and I talked offline about this, we were trying to even think about, are there some positives? Are there any silver linings in this for women? And the one thing we brought up is it has elevated some issues that have been issues pre-pandemic. Childcare has been an issue and a huge piece of this discrepancy, for women needing this support. So, we of course do early childcare here at the YWCA. It's so fantastic for me to not have to try to explain this to people, that they're hearing more about it now. And I also think maybe even for some of the men who were working remotely and having kids there too, even if the woman in the household was the primary caregiver, they're still getting a sense of like, wow, this is it's not easy, and I've heard that from parents as well and from men. So it will be interesting to see, are we willing to invest money in paying and educating early childcare workers who are women, most, are the majority in that segment, and are we willing to offset some of these costs and support this so that women really can come back in the workplace and be supported too. All right, so Sabrina, I really want to talk about this piece, because when we look at women just across the board and we take these median numbers, but then when we start to intersect that for women of color, and and I didn't bring this up with you, but when we look at COVID, it is women of color that are bearing the most burden of this. The highest eviction rates right now, the number of job loss in December was mostly women of color, or even white women were able to actually see some increases. So, so I want you to share with us a little bit, especially with your work. What do we think can be done to focus and improve wages and working conditions, especially as we're looking through the lens for women of color?
I will spend about 30 seconds just giving a few statistics. So the previous conversations that we've had, we can look at that specifically in terms of women of color, because the statistics break down a little bit. And I think it's an interesting story that builds perfectly on what Anne just gave as well. So I definitely am going to spend about 30-45 seconds doing that, and then I'll get to like actionable items, right? And so just to put this conversation in perspective with women of color in mind, throwing statistics out there, I've taught for enough years to know that not everybody remembers all these numbers from like an hour-long presentation. So I really kind of wanted to give some examples to really attach these ideas to. And so when we look at the breakdown of numbers, when we look at the 10 US occupations with the largest share of women of color, we're seeing at the top manicurists, pedicurists, maids, and then skincare specialists, home health aides. So a lot of things in the healthcare industry, the retail industry. And when we look at the top 10 occupations held by women, we're seeing things that have been mentioned before, like cashiers, and again, maids, housekeepers, registered nurses. And so really trying to put a face to those occupations that women of color are being dismissed from. But when they are staying in the workforce, acknowledging that they are essential workers that have an incredibly increased probability of catching COVID or getting sick. And so that's going to play into some of the points I have in a minute. But I really wanted to build on that great overview that Anne gave us and show, as far as women of color, what their households look like, because some of it may be surprising and then some of it might not be. But so when you look at Indigenous women or Native American women, 67% of those mothers and 44% of Asian or Pacific Islander mothers provide at least 40% of their family's income. And so that's been mentioned before, that when you lose, almost half of a family's income, that's going to have impacts. But then I also think a really important point is that 67% of Black mothers and 41% of Latina or Hispanic mothers are actually the primary income earners for their family. And that's compared with only 37% of white mothers. And so when you do look at averages, our blood boils, to borrow your words from earlier, and we know we need action, which all of us are taking in a number of forms. But when you really look at these numbers as they break down for women of color, you're seeing some more nuanced stories. And it's also suggesting to us that one just big band-aid to eliminate these barriers is not necessarily going to be the solution. We really need to look at the lived experiences of women of color if we're going to solve this idea of inequality across salary. And so I will move real quickly to, what can we do, kind of being actionable. And I think this was mentioned earlier, but in a very different context, measuring things accurately. And so when we think of women of color and the COVID numbers coming out and the job loss statistics coming out, we can see losses across the board, and that is so concerning. When we also think of just, it's purely in terms of COVID numbers, the number of deaths, especially in communities of color, I mean, no one even wants to continue that conversation. Nobody can even wrap their head around that and those numbers. But if you actually, you do continue that conversation, for communities of color, for women of color, there is even a greater impact of these alarming numbers of job loss and deaths in this time. And what I mean by that is, let's take the example of Indigenous populations, Native American populations. When we're looking at a situation where within a week we go from elder respected community members, passing on cultural traditions, passing on languages that younger generations have not fully, embraced yet, or fully, that hasn't been kind of passed down to the next generation yet. And then within a week, you have these respected elder members of tribes or of communities getting sick, being on a ventilator, then passing on. You're not just losing a life, which is like unimaginable in and of itself, but you're also losing cultures and traditions and languages. Like, it's this bigger, huger impact that, when women are really burdened or, have on our shoulders, like filling in all the gray spots of making society kind of work and being functional. That can even make our jobs even harder when, our cultural traditions and the bigger impacts of COVID and these job losses just aren't being taken into account. So when I say measure things accurately, it's really upsetting when some states still aren't even accounting for Indigenous peoples or Native Americans in their data, rather than what they're doing is just putting them in the other column, along with mixed race individuals and things that don't fall neatly in their data. And that is a huge disservice, because we're not really truly understanding the impact for women of color. And like I said, it can be more than just an individual life or an individual career. It can have entire community impacts. The one last thing I'll say is, and this goes along very well with my work that I publish, is in order to really speak to this experience of people of color, we need to fix our diversity and inclusion climates at our organizations. If you think all the way back to COVID, kind of our beginning images of it, we know that, it starting in China and the news stories originating from there really made it to where Asian and Pacific Islander employees are still to this day under increased, discrimination, getting threats, increased xenophobia that they're experiencing. And so all of these issues that we're talking about, and some that we're, have insanely, but that is 2020 and 2021 kind of being put on the sidelines because there's a huge pandemic and things like that. We can't have those on the sidelines. We have to consider these intersecting topics and how they're working together, especially against women of color in presenting additional barriers. But you can't forget about the fact that a lot of communities of color are experiencing increased racism right now due to COVID, and putting that, of course, we know bias, impacts salary negotiations and how people are treated, both policy and procedure wise, but then also interpersonally. So these are just a few examples that we haven't mentioned yet. That's like, we need to take action, measuring things correctly, fixing our diversity and inclusion climates to really address some of these factors related to COVID that are really intersecting the experiences of women of color that have been kind of on the sidelines of conversation nowadays, because we're so focused on getting our economy back, getting the healthcare system on its feet again. And of course, that completely makes sense. But for women of color, we need to really think of that. those intersecting topics to really address their lived experiences right now, in my opinion.
Yeah, thank you. Gosh, I appreciate there's so much there, right? There's a lot for us to be looking at, but I love your point of we have to look at it together. You know, it can't be individually. These pieces are all connected. And so we do it a disservice when we just try to focus on, you know, really one-dimensional part of it.
Yeah.
I do want to ask our audience, please feel free if you have a question to put it in the question and answer box. If you don't have a question, you all are doing such an incredible job of explaining everything. It's highly possible that the questions that are coming up, you're answering so quickly, but do feel free. We have just a few minutes left, so I want to make sure we get to any questions that are outstanding. You know, Michelle and Faith, I just want to give you an opportunity too, as we're talking through this discussion, and I know Representative Winter, you just came back in, but we're really talking about these intersecting points, and especially as we're looking at the impacts for women of color and communities of color. And so I'd just like to see, you know, from both of you, just any other sort of thoughts you have on that. And even looking at it, Michelle, as you were looking at Boulder, I know we didn't kind of take that next layer with it, but just any thoughts or observations from either of you?
I would just say that it's absolutely intersectional, and this system is very clearly designed to try and divide us. The system is very clearly designed to say, you should only talk about racial inequity, or you should talk about homophobia, or you should talk about sexism, and really it's all layered together. And something that I don't know if we talked about when I was missing, and I apologize, but we're going to continue to have pharmacists in the state. It's good news. Is I think a lot of what women face in the workforce also is burnout culture, right? The expectation that you work really long hours. And my background is in nonprofits and progressive campaigns. And if you aren't willing to be underpaid and work really long hours, then you're just not passionate enough, right? And you just don't care enough, and you don't want to make a difference enough. And we have to change that, because I feel very strongly that burnout culture is actually very much based in racism and white supremacy and the patriarchy. And it's something that we also need to be able to change.
Yeah, we actually have a question. So Michelle, just hang on here. The question coming in from one of our participants is, what is the best way for an applicant to push back against a hiring manager that asks for payment history despite the new law? So what do we do with that? Right now it's in law, but what happens in reality? And what should we do?
I mean, there's the legal piece, right? So you should report it to the Colorado Association of, right? You should report it to CADA, to CCRD, Colorado. Oh my gosh, now I'm just speaking in acronyms. But there's a place to report it, and you should report it. But in the moment, that's really scary, right? And in the moment, you're trying to get a job, and that's a lot to ask for applicants. And so seek support from other people that are looking at jobs. Role play what it's like if you are in a job interview and someone asks you for your history, and ultimately do it in a way, right? And that says, I'm really smart and I actually know this, and I'm being a benefit to you right now. But yeah, it's scary, and it's not going to stop being scary, and that stinks.
Yeah, and that the ramifications sometimes to be able to write it have to be legal, which is a whole different conversation as well. We just have a few minutes. So Michelle, I actually want to give you the last word, and then we're just going to close things out.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to what everyone else has said. But I do agree that culture is a big part of the issue that we have, especially regarding COVID. And it's like, we do see the numbers of women who are kind of leaving the workforce in order to like provide safe education for their children, and they don't really have a safe place to work. And I don't really see that conversation happening as much on the male side of things. And so, you know, it is unfortunate that those numbers have come out and that women, once again, are not really being prioritized. And we are looking for them to kind of, you know, carry the world on their shoulders. And And so culturally speaking, I hope that we can get to a point where women are not expected to carry the burden of these things.
Yeah, a lot. We do have a lot of work to do, but together, I think that it feels, that it looks like there's some promising legislation. I think as women, we really need to pay attention to the bigger issues, especially when we look at for women of color. Like we've got to start, I think, in this movement, making sure that it's like that we're doing this piece for sure. So I want to just thank you all so very much for what an incredible group of women you are. And thank you so much for the work you're doing in this every day and leading in this. So we sure appreciate that. And I just want to close out to let our audience know we have a few things coming up at the YWCA. So when you support the YWCA, these are the types of programs that you're supporting as well. So we actually, we have a new anti-racist, it's racial justice and equity education and training. It's a 3-week series that we have coming up. So that's a great place to start. We've already had, gosh, more than 200 community members and organizations go through this since June. So wanted to make you all aware of that. And then we also have our big gala, which of course we have to raise funds in order to be able to do this really important work as well. So that is coming up March 8th, and it is virtual, but it is going to be still an incredible event with great opportunity. And I guess at least you can, wear just a nice top and jogging pants or whatever, yoga pants, instead of having to get all dressed up. But in our this year, the title is Lights, Camera, and Take Action. So we'll be spotlighting some incredible women in our community and the work that they're doing. So thank you all for being here. This is part of a series. We're going to be continuing these discussions, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.